I really appreciate it. I've thrown together some slides to answer some questions that were given to me about the state of the pandemic currently, the implications of long COVID, how effective are masks, etc. And I have not reviewed these slides, so they're going to be a surprise to me as well. That's okay. So let me share my screen right now. And here we go. You can all see that, right? Excellent. So let's talk about the state of the pandemic. Um, First, I thought I'd show you what the new cases look like across Canada. It looks like it's somewhat stabilized in the past few weeks, but this can be misleading because we're not retesting. And so all we're seeing here is the results of formal PCR testing. And as you probably know, nobody gets PCR tests anymore unless you have a particular reason for it. Everybody else takes rapid tests or just assumes they've got COVID and go about their day. So this does not tell us a whole lot. And here's the data from Manitoba, same situation. It's sort of seems to have stabilized. The deaths, on the other hand, are hard to miss. They're a good indicator of where things are. And the deaths have also stabilized, but at a very high level. And it's fair to say, I think, that the disease now is not what it was in 2020. It's a different disease by virtue of vaccination. It's no longer the existential threat to many of us. It is to many people, as you can see here, with about 26 people dying every day. So it's no joke to them. But it's not going to stop society anymore, at least in terms of mortality. And with Manitoba, again, similar kinds of trends, averaging a handful of deaths every day, each one tragic, each one probably preventable as well. But this is an interesting graph here. This is the number of COVID patients in hospital from 2020 to 2022. And what we're seeing here is that the peaks are lower, but the troughs are higher in general, right? And that's indicative of the state of hyperendemicity in which we find ourselves. So yeah, we probably are looking at some degree of an endemic disease, meaning that it's always here. The tides don't come in and out as often. We're always sort of ankle deep in water, except it's not ankle deep. It's more like it's knee deep. And that's a challenging place to be in public health. A more nuanced approach, if you're looking for the risk posed by COVID in your area, is to look at this website, covid19resources.ca, put together by Dr. Tara Moriarty at U of T. She's an expert on risk analysis and has been a guiding light throughout the pandemic. And she takes it upon herself to give regular updates about the nature of risk across the country. And right now, she computes that about 1 in 43 people is currently infected with COVID-19 in Canada. And here you can see which are the serious provinces, which are the less serious provinces. So the very high places across the nation, BC, Manitoba, Quebec, Saskatchewan, severe actually are the Atlantic provinces. And here is a graphic she puts together on her website showing you how to appreciate the hazards posed by COVID-19 a quick way. So things don't look great, despite the fact that no one in media talks about it. And when I say things don't look great, what I mean is your chances of being exposed to COVID are high, which means your chances of getting infected and reinfected are also high, even though your chances of dying have diminished. So let's talk about long COVID then, because we're no longer that concerned about mortality. Yes, we're concerned about mortality, of course. It would be great to prevent more mortality, and too many people are dying. But the looming challenge here is long COVID, the specter of mass disability that is looking us down the barrel. And just some quick stats on that. A Harvard economist has computed that in the USA, long COVID is going to cost that country over $2 trillion in economic impact. Lost wages, insurance costs, health costs, whatever it might be. And that's about 17% of American GDP. For reference, the Americans spend about 18% of GDP on healthcare as a whole. So it's comparable to the entirety of what is spent on healthcare. We don't know how many people will get long COVID, but a really good study, a Dutch study, suggests that about 12.7% of cases result in what we would call long COVID. So a conservative estimate would be 10% of all cases will result in long COVID. So the more you are reinfected, the more that risk probably accumulates for you individually. More severe COVID cases are more likely to become long COVID cases, and vaccination does reduce your chances. By how much? Not as much as you might think. 15% is a number that is bandied about of reducing your risk. That's for 2 doses. With each additional dose, there's probably additional protection, but that math has not been done yet. So I don't really know what 3, 4, 5 boosters can do for you. You can't get long COVID if you don't get infected. And a bivalent boost will improve your ability to prevent infection to a very high level, at least for a little while. So there's every expectation that being boosted appropriately will reduce your overall chances of long COVID. You probably hear in the news all the time the sudden heart attacks that are happening across all age groups. It is affecting all age groups. That's what the new data is suggesting. Every age group, if you've experienced COVID, has an elevated risk of heart attack. But interestingly, it's the 25 to 44-year-old age group that are at highest risks for reasons I don't fully understand yet. And for this group, again, vaccination lowers the risk. So one more reason to get vaccinated and boosted, despite the anti-vaxxer rhetoric that vaccination has its own heart disease risks. And it does, myocarditis and pericarditis, but those are extremely mild in comparison to an actual heart attack. And COVID also carries, of course, its risk of myocarditis and pericarditis as well. In other words, the risk of the vaccine is trivial, minuscule, hardly worth talking about it when compared to the extraordinary risk posed by COVID itself. The treatments for long COVID right now are few. It's approached syndromically, meaning they will treat the symptoms as they arise. For example, the most common symptoms are fatigue and brain fog or attention deficit. And those are treated with attention deficit drugs, including N-acetylcysteine, for example. So they're not approaching the root cause yet because it's not clear what the root cause is. It could be anything from lingering viral presence, immune inflammation that lingers, or tissue damage caused by infection. It's unclear. There is a trial underway to see if Paxlovid can be used to treat long COVID because it seems that people who took Paxlovid when infected are less likely to report long COVID symptoms later on. So that's promising. The best bet, of course, is to avoid being infected in the first place, which is what I encourage everyone to do. Let's talk about masks now. Masks work, despite what people might be saying, despite the noise in social media and media, masks absolutely work. Here's a wonderful graphic from CDC showing the results of a very good case control study showing that if you wear a mask, your odds of testing positive for COVID later on are greatly diminished. And if you wear a respirator mask, an N95, KN95, you have an 83% lower risk. That's extraordinary. That's better than the vaccine efficacy to prevent infection, obviously. And yet we have these other studies that create noise in the system. So I want to take a moment to talk about those other studies if they are causing some confusion. The Bangladeshi study was widely cited by anti-maskers for a while, and that looked at tens of thousands of people living in villages in Bangladesh. And it was a randomized control trial, sort of. One group was given a strong mask recommendation, the other group was not. And the results is that those who got the mask recommendation saw a decrease in COVID-like symptoms of about 11 to 12%, which does not sound like a lot, but to my mind, that's an extraordinary reduction in symptomatology, given that the actual changes in mask usage was to go from 13% to 42%. In other words, in both the control arm and the treatment arm, people were wearing masks to a lesser degree. So less than a majority were not wearing masks. So that's why you can't take a lot away from these kinds of randomized trials. It doesn't tell you a whole lot. But to my mind, given that there's only a handful of a few percentage points difference between the extent of mask wearing, and you still get almost 12% difference in symptoms, that's an extraordinarily good signal to my mind. Recently, there was a Cochrane review that looked at whether or not masks can result in population level diminishing of transmission. And that resulted in all kinds of noise. So here at the bottom here, we've got a couple of reports. New York Times opinion column written by Brett Stevens says that mask mandates did nothing. What we learned from this, here you have someone tweeting the Cochrane review saying that wearing a mask probably did little or nothing. That's an incorrect takeaway from this study. And here are some of the criticisms of the study. First of all, these kinds of reviews are looking almost exclusively at randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials aren't always the gold standard. They are for clinical medicine, but mask wearing is not clinical medicine, right? So for engineering tools, engineering studies tend to be the gold standard. The review starts with the assumptions that the masks provide respiratory protection. They don't. Only N95s and respirators provide respiratory protection. Surgical masks are not designed for that purpose. We have mixed targeted use with constant use. So in some studies, people are using them strategically, and some studies are using them all the time. And all, if not most, if not all of the studies looked at whether or not the mask provided the wearer protection and didn't look at whether or not other people were protected by the wearer. But the biggest issue here is that randomized controlled trials can really only test whether or not mask compliance was effective, not whether the masks themselves were effective. And what they almost all find is that compliance as a result of strong recommendations is poor, like in the Bangladeshi study. So the takeaway isn't that masks don't work, it's that we don't use them enough or appropriately. Then there's a study put out by Dr. Mark Loeb from McMaster University, and this made a bit of a hullabaloo a couple months ago. The conclusion they made was surgical masks are just as good as N95 masks for healthcare workers. So why bother giving them N95s? Therefore, why bother giving me and you N95s? We can get by with surgical masks. The problem is, it was a really bad study. I would say it's an atrocious study. And it's what some people call an unplanned crossover trial. So the people who wanted to wear N95s midway through the trial were allowed to. And there was inconsistent use of the mask. It was not enforced. I like this quote from this commentator. The big problem with the study is that they didn't really compare N95 use to surgical mask use. They compared occasional N95 to occasional surgical use, just with somewhat different instructions. And this last sentence is kind of damning. When the methods are reframed in that way, it's pretty clear that the outcome of this trial was determined before it even started. I'm not going to make that accusation, but many people were suspecting that this study was created to justify some policy decisions that were made early in the pandemic, i.e. to deny nurses N95s when they should have had them. I promised I would not talk about air filtration because our next speaker is an expert on that. I just want to say that there are good studies showing that air filtration is a highly effective, low-cost endeavor to slow transmission. In particular, the use of these things called Corsi-Rosenthal boxes, which are do-it-yourself creations. And this one study here showed that they're 10 times cheaper, but they're comparable to HEPA filters. But the next speaker will hopefully talk about that more. I want to talk, the last thing I want to talk about is the threat of immune dysregulation. So if you don't know what this is, there are some immunologists who are claiming that COVID infection and reinfection poses a risk of damaging or prematurely aging your immune system, and that this might be the cause of these other societal signals of increased infectious diseases like scarlet fever in the UK, RSV in children in North America, and so forth. And it may be increasing our susceptibility to other infections for months or years, or even decades to come, who knows? It is unclear whether this is the case, but it's scary enough to take it seriously. There was a big study in the US as part of the Veteran Affairs hospital system, and they showed that reinfection increases the chances of hospitalization and death and other kinds of bad outcomes. And every time you got reinfected, the probability of one of those bad outcomes increased. And vaccination didn't seem to have any sort of mitigating effect on that relationship. I hasten to say that this study, as impactful and intriguing as it is, was on a particular population of high-risk individuals. So it's unclear if that can be generalized to everybody else. But it's enough to have us take pause, that maybe we should be really trying hard not to be infected and reinfected. So what can be done? This is my final slide. Avoid being infected. If you've been infected, avoid being reinfected. Yes, live your life, absolutely, but take reasonable steps, and we'll be talking about that as well, reasonable steps to avoid infection. Get vaccinated and boosted. Vaccines do work. 2 doses, to my mind, are great for keeping you out of the hospital and out of the morgue, but are no longer effective in preventing infection and transmission. But additional boosters does improve that probability to a noticeable extent. Air filtration in places like classrooms need to be considered. I carry a CO2 monitor around. Do I have mine with me here? Here it is. Here's my CO2 monitor. If I go into a public indoor space, I use this to determine the quality of the airflow. Wear a respirator mask in public indoor settings when you do not understand the exposure risks. And the last thing I'll say is we should be advocating for mucosal vaccines. A mucosal vaccine is one that enters through the mucosa, so your nose or your mouth. And the reason for that is if you imagine a bouncer at a nightclub trying to keep out the bad guys. So it's easier, more effective to keep out the troublemakers before they get into the nightclub, rather than trying to muscle them out once they start causing problems. So a mucosal vaccine seeks to elicit an immune reaction where the virus is entering your body to keep it out in the first place. And a lot of work is being done on these. And if we can get them working well, this can prevent infection and transmission and bring us back to genuine normality. India has a mucosal vaccine developed in the University of Washington. Data is slowly coming, but they are rolling it out en masse. We have several in clinical trials at the moment, but the enthusiasm for developing further ones and for having them considered by our governments is not there. And the reason for that is there's so much anti-vaccination sentiment that there isn't a market incentive for drug companies to take on this challenge, unfortunately. But I hope that we find the wherewithal to advocate for these new vaccines because we need them. That is the last of my slides. So I guess we move on to the next presentation. Oh, yeah.
Well, I think first everyone can use their emojis to join me in thanking you for that. Some really terrifying, but also exciting and fascinating stuff in there. So thanks so much, Ray. And go ahead, please, Shauna.
Okay. It's always where I find out if I'm going to share the right screen. Okay. So thanks for inviting me to speak to everyone about one of my favorite topics, HVAC systems. Actually, it's a very important topic to talk about the role of ventilation and filtration in healthy environments. And so I'm really pleased to do that today with you and to talk a little bit about, see if I'm going to be able to advance my screen, my slides, to talk a little bit about COVID and the workplace and the role of ventilation there. How likely are you going to catch COVID-19 in the workplace at University of Manitoba? I could say that it's almost a behavioral question as much as it's a technical question, because it really depends on whether there are people carrying the virus there. And in preparation for this talk tonight, I looked at this 2021 OnePoll survey that revealed that 78% of them felt the pressure to work when sick. And they also felt, 69% of them felt that a cough wasn't enough to keep them from work. So given that this poll was taken really just after when the first vaccines were released, it is surprising the pressure people feel and how our students might feel to attend the workplace even when they're sick. Infection risks for catching the virus indoors has to do with three main factors: load, how many people are there shedding the virus, how long and the time of duration that you're exposed, and the dilution rate and how much clean air there is in relation to that room size. So these are factors I'll talk about in relation to ventilation systems. So I'm going to do a little bit of review. Maybe there'll be a quiz at the end, but for some of you probably well know already that SARS-CoV-2 is transferred through airborne transmission. Respiratory fluid or saliva comes out as we breathe or talk, carrying the virus to someone else. They're usually carried in droplets, which tend to be fewer and bigger and drop down a short distance away within 0.3 to 1.5 meters. But more importantly, they also are found in aerosol which are smaller droplets, smaller than the width of a hair, as is shown in this diagram. And these aerosol droplets linger longer in the air. They can travel farther than droplets, and they can linger in the air for quite some time. In fact, we've been able to see that aerosols in poorly ventilated spaces tend to build up, just like cigarette smoke, just like urine in a swimming pool. And the more that people exert themselves yelling and singing or talking or exercising, the more of the virus they expel into these aerosolized particles. And because the aerosolized particles float in the air for hours, you can possibly go into an empty room, but the aerosols from that infected person may still be there. So really, as probably one of the best defenses you have is a well-fitting mask. But when you don't have a well-fitting mask, the next line of defense is the indoor environment and the ventilation system. So indoor ventilation is part, as we've talked about, just a variety of methods of preventing transmission of the virus. Its primary role is to increase the amount of outside fresh air or create dilution. When you have a high number of particles in the air, or if you're inside an enclosed room with the windows shut, with poor ventilation, those particles tend to start to fill up the room and become more concentrated. And of course, there's no escaping, so the room fills up and your exposure is more likely. When you have good ventilation and potentially the opportunity to open windows, the aerosols can be exhausted and replaced with clean air. Therefore, the very first role of ventilation system is to exhaust polluted air and provide more clean air and dilute the viral load in the space. The other thing that mechanical ventilation can do for you is redirect or produce airflow in the space. And generally, we want that airflow to be going out of the breathing space and into and above us, and to be exhausted above us and out of the room. The other role of ventilation system is to provide filtration and to capture the virus and clean the air. And fourthly is humidification and temperature control, which has an impact on the viability of the virus in this aerosolized form. Many University of Manitoba buildings have openable windows, and in combination with mechanical ventilation systems. And in engineering and architecture talk, this is called a mixed mode ventilation system. So obviously opening a window is a really great idea to increase the amount of fresh air, and the air will be naturally drawn into the space. And then, as you can see in this diagram on the left, it'll be drawn up into the plenum space because that area is being basically sucked out by a fan as part of the mechanical ventilation. Mixed mode systems generally operate seasonally. They work in the fall and they work in the spring because the windows are open for something called free cooling. We can get free air conditioning if we open the window. So a lot of the buildings were designed this way so that you don't have to condition the air in the shoulder seasons, the fall and the spring. But in Winnipeg, the winter is so cold that the heating system is not able to adequately condition the rooms. So the temperature in the room can fall quite dramatically if you open the window. Similarly, in the summer, the air conditioning systems can't cool the air fast enough if you open a window, so the room can heat up pretty fast. Another downside of opening the windows in our Winnipeg winters is an image I took from our Faculty of Architecture, where the pipes along the window that provide the heating, the steam pipes along the window that provide the heating, were exposed to a window open overnight, froze, broke, and of course this giant flood happened in the morning. Airflow, whether you're using a mechanical ventilation system or an open window, can be in heavily occupied spaces like classrooms and cafeterias and lounges and study halls. Have to be carefully considered. So it's less likely that viruses are going to spread through the ductwork of ventilation system, but opening a window or the way air is delivered into the room by the mechanical system itself may cause the airflow to go from an infected person over susceptible folks and therefore spread the virus to them. So creating this turbulent air inside spaces is what happens when you have an open window and you have the air is pushed through, as you see on the left diagram, towards a vent, or when you have a mixing system like we often do on the campus here, which delivers air from above, and it delivers it at a speed to create some mixing to happen. So it creates some turbulence in the room. So you can see in this diagram, there's only one fella standing there, but if this room was filled with multiple people, the turbulence could spread the virus from this individual to the others in the room. On the right-hand side is something called the displacement system, where the ventilation system provides air infiltration lower, and therefore it uses very low fan speed. So the thermal plume, or the heat of the person's body, naturally causes the air to come to the person and rises up the person's body. So it uses very low fan speed. You wouldn't even feel a draft with this kind of system, and therefore it's very ideal. It's kind of like filling up a pool of water and moving the contaminants out of the breathing space. So different kinds of ventilation systems where you bring in the air low and you exhaust it higher are quite good for limiting the infection across people within a room. Just going to review about how commercial systems, ventilation systems work. Mechanical ventilation systems circulate air through the buildings using fans and ductwork. And it's important to remember that the air is a combination of outdoor air and recirculated air. And the outdoor air composition is generally from 10 to 30%, and recirculated air is 70 to 90%. So what you're really breathing is a majority of the air is over 3/4 of it is recirculated. In the coldest and again, the hottest times of the year, the percentage of outdoor air that's recirculated is reduced because the air handling units can't handle extreme temperatures. They freeze up and get locked out. So in some cases, the outdoor air contribution can be under 10%, but standards say you need to have at least 15 cubic feet of outdoor air per person. So before the air is recirculated in these systems, it goes through a machine which filters the air, humidifies it, cools or heats it, and then throws it back into the space. And you can see this happening on the right-hand side. And then the air is exhausted, the indoor air is exhausted and recirculated back through this system. Most systems are designed to provide somewhere between 3 and 4 complete air changes per hour. But the Harvard School of Health, since the pandemic, has been studying the best air changes since the pandemic and recommends up to 6 air changes per hour. Actually, a 2016 study of a Hong Kong hospital suggested that 9 air changes per hour reduced the spread of SARS and MERS and H1N1 in their facility. So basically, we want to see this cycling through frequently so that we have lots of dilution of any contaminated air. It's displacing the air that's contaminated and shooting it back out to be conditioned and humidified and treated. Bigger rooms, more people, more air changes per hour are required to create that clean air system situation. So if we zoom into that rooftop unit where filtration happens, it contains a filter that takes particulates out of the air, and the fineness of that filter will determine whether or not aerosols are captured before the air is recirculated. Another factor is whether the filter is maintained. Dirty air filters can cause a buildup of moisture and mold, and they can create a decrease in airflow. And again, we're trying to cycle air through this as many times as possible to replace the stale air. A dirty filter and a very fine filter can cause something called pressure drop also, which basically means that the air is not passing through the filter, and that obstruction can actually cause the unit to fail completely. MERV filters. I think more lay people have come to know what MERV stands for than have ever before. For those of you who haven't heard it yet, it stands for minimum efficiency reporting values. And you've probably heard of HEPA filters, which are high efficiency particulate air filters. At the University of Manitoba, our existing building systems, our ventilation systems, have something called a MERV 8. type filter in them. And you can't really see from the little diagram on the left-hand side, but they're relatively thin. They're designed to get most mold, most, kind of dust mites, pollens out of the air. So a standard commercial building tends to have a MERV 8, but since the pandemic, ASHRAE, the American Society for Heating and Refrigeration Engineers, has recommended that we go to something greater than a MERV 13, which can start to filter out bacteria, smoke fumes, sneezes. And of course, if we are in a healthcare setting where we have a high number of people with known viruses and flu and so forth, then we are looking at MERV 17 through 20, which can, you can see on the left-hand column, it can filter out, 0.3 microns and under 99% of the time, which is extraordinary. The difficulty at the University of Manitoba is that our existing air handling units are sized so they can't fit that thicker MERV 13 in all cases. So not all the air handling units have been upgraded to MERV 13. Most are still with the 8s. But the effort now is to try to make sure they're clean and functioning properly. So thank you, Ray, for mentioning the Corsi Rosenthal. Where you have an underventilated or unventilated space, you should definitely be considering portable air filtration units. Local filtration reduces aerosols very effectively. Anecdotally, they've seemed to be coming down, 90% aerosol reduction within 30 minutes. Effectively, these localized units are just fans with filters. The Corsi is a do-it-yourself method of building your own filtration unit. It's basically a box fan with 4 MERV 13 furnace filters built in. On the left-hand side is the one we built in the Fab Lab at the Faculty of Architecture. Actually, there was 12 of them built and stuck in our studio spaces and other areas around our faculty. They cost about $125 in materials, which, as was mentioned earlier, is significantly less than a lot of commercially available. That said, E.H. Price has been developing room air purifiers and ceiling air purifiers, which have been tested in the lab to increase, in the case of the wraps, an additional air change per hour equivalency, and the ceiling air purifiers 1 and 1.7 air changes per hour. So they're local and they can be moved around. That's certainly a room air purifier, and the Corsis can be moved around to where you need them most. I think if you are going to be purchasing yourself a portable air filtration unit, what you want to be looking at is the clean air delivery rate. The better, the higher the number, the better. I'll leave you with that. Don't waste your money on ionizers and plasmas and gadgets and plexiglass barriers. Plexiglass barriers especially can concentrate aerosols in pockets. It's just not a great idea. So have a look at these options and maybe build yourself a Corsi. The other factor I want to mention is that in winter, indoor air in Winnipeg tends to be drier and warmer because of heating systems. And humidity is an important factor in aerosols. And that means that when you decrease humidity in aerosols, the evaporation, makes them very dry, and they tend to float around and stay in the environment longer. And more worrisome is that by evaporating the fluids around them, they tend to encase the virus, which actually increases viability. So many ventilation systems contain humidification, which comes into that system right after filtration. Not all of our systems have humidification capabilities, but you can definitely measure the relative humidity in your workplace to see if you're in the optimum zone. You can see on the chart on the right, the optimum zone is somewhere between 40 and 60%. Which is ideal for a wide variety of bacteria and viruses and fungi and so forth. So it's kind of the sweet spot if you want to introduce your own humidification in your space. If you're measuring humidity less than 40% in your workplace.
And Shauna, we are at the end of your time. If you just maybe want to.
I've got just two more slides really to mention. I just wanted to also talk about CO2 measurement, just so we understand what it is. CO2 is released when people exhale. So we tend, as when we're doing performance measurements, we use it as a proxy for all sorts of ventilation effectiveness. But when we talk about COVID, COVID is something we exhale. So it's a very good proxy for airborne viruses. So when we measure CO2 levels, it's not generally a spot measurement. We measure it over time, and it's measured in relation to outdoor air. So outdoor air is normally at 400 parts per million. So I look for amounts that are at least twice as much of that, over 800 parts per million. And generally, if it's over 11 to 1500, then the system needs some looking into. So just some notes about that. At the University of Manitoba, there has been CO2 testing done by outside third parties. They've been measuring humidity, temperature, and CO2 levels. But interestingly, at University of Toronto, through the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, they've also been measuring particulates in these devices in classrooms and workplaces. So in conclusion, some things: ventilation, increase your outdoor air, increase air changes if you can, reduce indoor air turbulence. If you're going to open a window and you have a fan, point it out, don't point it into the room. If you can, displace air vertically towards the exhaust, the mechanical exhaust. Filtration, use the highest possible without reducing airflow. Clean your filters regularly. Use your portable air filtration units in under or non-ventilated areas. Higher humidity is better. Cooler temperatures are better. And monitor the system performance. And you can use CO2, look for any things that's over 800 to 1100 points per million as a starting point for concern. That's it.